the most powerful man in Chicago, had a strange habit that in 16 years not one of his men had ever dared to ask about. Every afternoon, when the light had gone gold across the lawn behind his estate by the lake, he would walk alone to the old oak at the far end of the garden, lie down in the grass, fold his hands across his chest and close his eyes, while his bodyguards kept watch 30 meters away, and no one was permitted to come any closer. They all believed their boss was simply resting after long nights without sleep. No one knew he closed his eyes in order to stay in the only place left in the world that still held the warmth of the mother who had fallen on the night his entire family was erased. Until one afternoon in May, the housemaid who had been working there for only 3 weeks crossed the lawn with a tea tray in her hands, and she stopped. A single stray leaf had just come to rest in that man's hair. She had been given 3 rules in this house, and the third rule was that she must never, under any circumstance, go near the master while he lay beneath the oak. But her hand moved before her reason could stop it. She lifted the leaf away, then smoothed his hair back 3 times, slowly, in the same direction each time the way she had been doing for 2 years, to a younger brother, who could no longer move. The man's right hand slid toward the pistol beneath his left ribs and stopped exactly 1 knuckle short, because in his entire life, only one person had ever touched him that way. He did not open his eyes right away. He was afraid that if he did, that small mercy would vanish, and he would be alone under the tree again, the way he had been alone under it for 16 years. The housemaid had no idea whom she had just touched. Still less did she know that within a few days, the very hands that had lifted this leaf would open a secret. An entire empire had been hunting for 16 years and never found, and that the secret was tied to the death of her own father. Before the story begins, please leave a comment and let us know where you are listening from tonight. And do not forget to press the like button and subscribe to the channel to support us. Now, let us begin. He opened his eyes. The May sky blazed white through the spaces between the leaves. Then a woman's face appeared within it, and for the span of exactly 1 heartbeat, Cassian Vitali didn't know what year he was in. Then the hand resting on his hair pulled away. Marin stumbled backward, the tea tray still clutched in her other hand, and with the reflex of someone who had learned by heart that every mistake carried a price, she dropped to her knees on the grass. Her knees struck the ground before she even had time to think. 30 meters behind her, the 2 bodyguards took half a step forward, then stopped short, because they had been trained for intruders, for gunmen, for an unfamiliar car at the gate, but no one had ever taught them what to do with a maid who had just stroked their employer's hair. Cassian slowly sat up. He saw the crown of her bowed head, saw both her hands pressed flat against the grass, and heard her speak in a voice so steady it was frightening. The voice of someone who had rehearsed these words in her mind many times for other situations. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't say it had been an accident. She asked to be allowed to finish the month. Just 11 more days, because the nursing center collected payment on the 1st. And if she couldn't pay the full amount this month, her younger brother would be transferred to the general care ward, where he would receive physical therapy only twice a week. She said she would leave first thing on the morning of the 2nd. She said she wouldn't tell anyone about what had just happened. Then she fell silent and lowered her head even farther. Cassian studied that shape for a long time. A woman with her face bowed to the earth before a man, because she was certain he could erase her from this world without anyone ever asking what had happened to her. He had created that shape hundreds of times over the course of 11 years. On the warehouse floor at the southern docks, in the back room of a laundromat on Halsted Street, in hotel corridors, in parking lots, in rooms no one afterward cared to mention again. He had always stood on the other side, and he had always believed it was justified. This was the first time in his life that he had seen it from where he stood now, from the side of a man who had just been touched for a reason that had nothing to do with fear, and he realized how ugly it truly was. What rose inside his chest wasn't anger, it was closer to shame, and he wasn't accustomed to it. "Stand up," he said. She didn't move. He said it again, more softly than the first time. "Stand up. No one is going to hurt you here." Marin looked up. She had imagined many things when she dropped to her knees, but none of them resembled the words she had just heard, and for a second, she thought she might have misunderstood him. She rose, her legs unsteady, and the tea tray tilted slightly in her hand. Cassian opened his right hand. The stray leaf lay in his palm, its stem slightly crushed, because he had closed his fist around it without realizing. "You left this in my hair," he said. "I believe it belongs to you." Marin looked at the leaf, then at him, then back at the leaf. "It's only a leaf, sir." "Then it costs you nothing to take it." She held out her hand, hating it for trembling. The leaf fell into her palm so lightly that she barely felt it. "What is your name?" "Marin Delaney, sir." How long have you worked here? 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he repeated. Then they must have told you the 3 rules. She said they had. He asked whether she remembered the 3rd one. She said yes, sir. Then do you know why you broke it anyway? Marin remained silent longer than she had intended. Then she told him the truth, because she no longer had enough strength to invent a convincing lie. Because my younger brother lies exactly like that, sir. He has for the past 2 years, and there is always something falling into his hair. Cassian said nothing more. He stood, brushed the grass from his sleeves, and walked toward the house. Halfway across the lawn, he stopped without turning around and spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. Go on with your work. No one is dismissing you. In that house, people had disappeared for things far smaller than this. But that afternoon, the only thing that disappeared was the 30 meters of distance that no one had dared to cross in 16 years. Marin hadn't even reached the kitchen door when Constance Bloom was already standing there. And she didn't say a word until she had pulled Marin all the way into the back kitchen, where the old stove still hissed, and there were no cameras mounted in the 4 corners of the room. She closed the door. Her hand rested on the wooden table, and Marin saw it trembling, the tremor of a woman of 62 who had worked in this house for 30 years and had never allowed anyone to see her hands shake. Do you have any idea what you just did? She asked. Marin set down the tea tray. The leaf was still lying in her left palm, and because she didn't know what to do with it, she simply continued holding it there. I took a leaf out of his hair, she said. Constance looked at her as if she had just claimed that she had merely opened a door for someone while the entire building was burning. You crossed the 30-meter boundary, she said. In the 30 years I've been here, no one has ever crossed it. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't dare. She spoke very quickly, her voice barely more than a breath, telling Marin that the guards outside had taken half a step forward and then stopped short, and that hesitation was the only thing that had saved her that afternoon, because they had been trained to react to an unfamiliar car, a shadow beyond the wall, a hand slipping inside a coat. But no one had ever taught them what to do when a maid from inside the house paused for a few seconds with a tea tray in her hand and then reached out. People don't have instincts prepared for things that have never happened before, she said. And you should pray to God that this never happens a second time. Marin was silent for a while. Then she asked the question she had been asking in her own mind for 3 weeks but had never dared speak aloud. The question that the 2nd rule of the house forbade her from asking. Mrs. Bloom, why that tree? There are so many trees in the garden. Why is everyone afraid of that one? Constance didn't answer at once. She turned away, opened the faucet, washed a glass that was already clean, then shut off the water. When she turned back, her face had changed, and Marin saw something there that she would remember for a very long time. Something like a door opening half a centimeter before closing again. Because that was the last place the lady of the house ever sat, she said. Then she fell silent. Marin waited. She waited for a name, a year, a story, anything that might follow those words. But Constance merely picked up the dish towel, folded it in half, then into quarters, and said that there were still 3 trays of dishes beside the sink on the 3rd floor, waiting to be cleared away. That was how a woman who had survived for 30 years by knowing exactly when to remain silent ended a conversation. Marin walked out, and as she crossed the threshold, she heard Constance speak once more behind her, so softly that she might have been speaking only to herself. You thought he lay there to sleep. He doesn't, child. At that same moment, Emmett Rourke stood at the 2nd floor corridor window, looking down at the lawn. He had been standing there from the beginning, and he had seen everything. From the second the leaf fell, to the second the most powerful man in Chicago rose, brushed the grass from his sleeves, and walked away without killing anyone. His expression revealed nothing. There was no displeasure on his face, no trace of emotion, nothing but the perfectly calm concentration of a man weighing an unfamiliar object in his palm to determine how heavy it was. He looked down for exactly 3 seconds. Then he withdrew his gloved left hand from his coat pocket, pulled the edge of the glove tight, and continued toward the study. In a house where everyone knew how to remain silent, the most dangerous thing wasn't the forbidden question. The most dangerous thing was the man standing behind the window, silently measuring something the rest of the house hadn't yet begun to understand. That night, after clearing away the 3 trays of dishes on the 3rd floor, Marin sat on the edge of the bed in her small room in the servants' wing and took an envelope with worn edges from the drawer. It contained 2 things, a bill from Ridgeview Nursing Center and a photograph taken outside the workshop, with her father standing in the middle, Marin on the left, and Owen on the right, while behind the 3 of them hung a wooden sign bearing the words Delaney and Son. She replaced the leaf on the photograph without understanding why she did it. 2 years earlier, in the hours before dawn on an April morning, the Delaney and Son bookbinding workshop in Bridgeport caught fire at 4:15. Her father, Hollis Delaney, 54 years old, didn't make it out. With 30 years' worth of paper, animal glue, and bookbinding solvents stored inside a building of 1.5 stories, the fire traveled the full length of the workshop in less than 20 minutes. Owen was 20 at the time and had been sleeping in the loft because he had stayed late the night before to finish a leather binding order, and he did make it out. They pulled him through a window at the back, but a support beam had already fallen on him, and the doctors at Mercy told Marin in very gentle voices that the damage to his spinal vertebrae couldn't be repaired. He had been in a wheelchair ever since. He hadn't been able to sew another book spine ever since, because the injury left his hands partially paralyzed and unable to hold a needle, and Marin thought that was the cruelest part of all. After 6 weeks, the fire department reached its conclusion. An electrical short in the old circuit breaker panel, no sign of outside interference. The case was closed. The insurance company paid only part of the claim because her father's policy had expired in February and he hadn't yet renewed it. The kind of forgetfulness that was so much like him, a man who could remember the exact stitch in any book, but could never remember when a payment was due. But there was one detail Marin had told the investigator 3 times, and all 3 times she had watched the tip of his pen stop against the paper and then lift without writing anything down. She had slept at the workshop that night because she was in the middle of a restoration job. She was the first person to run into the street. And as she stood in the middle of Morgan Street and looked back, she saw a man standing across the road beneath the awning of a closed auto repair shop. He didn't run over. He didn't call anyone. He simply stood there, watching with both hands in his pockets. And Marin remembered exactly one thing about him. He was wearing gloves in April. Then he turned and walked away. The investigator asked whether she had seen his face clearly. She said no. He asked whether she was certain it hadn't merely been a neighbor who had come outside to watch. She said she wasn't certain, and so her statement never appeared in the file, because in this city, a woman of 25 who had just lost her father and was standing in the middle of the street at 4 a.m. wasn't considered a witness worth recording. 2 years later, she had learned one number by heart: $4,800 a month. That was the cost of Owen's room, his medication, and 4 physical therapy sessions each week at Ridgeview. She had worked 3 jobs at once: washing dishes at a restaurant on Archer Avenue, cleaning offices in the Loop from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, and taking in laundry from 4 households in the neighborhood, yet the 3 jobs combined still left her nearly half the amount short. Then, 3 weeks earlier, an employment agency called her about a position as a live-in maid at a lakeside mansion. The pay was 4 times higher, with all room and board included. The woman on the telephone described the owner of the house in exactly 1 sentence: a private businessman in the shipping industry. Then she added a second sentence, and the second one was the truth. You don't ask questions. You keep your eyes lowered. Marin understood immediately. She had grown up in Bridgeport, and she knew what words like those meant. But the night before that call, she had stood in front of her refrigerator, staring at half a carton of milk and nothing else, and calculated that if she came up short that month, Owen would be transferred to the general care ward, where he would receive only 2 therapy sessions a week. There are some doors people walk through not because they are brave, but because there is no longer any room behind them to retreat. At 7 that evening, the only light left in the second-floor study came from the brass lamp on the desk, and the door opened without a knock because there was only one person in that house who was permitted to enter that way. Emmett Rourke stepped inside, placed a cup of coffee beside Cassian's elbow as he had done for 16 years, then sat in the chair across from him. He said nothing for nearly 30 seconds. Then he took an envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the desk, pushing it forward until it stopped exactly halfway between them. Cassian didn't look at the envelope. He looked at the gloved left hand that had just withdrawn. "What is this?" he asked. "An apartment on the north side," Rourke said. 20th floor. Reinforced door. Security in the building. It comes with an allowance large enough to last 2 years, enough to pay Ridgeview every month without falling short once. That woman will have more than she ever dreamed of when she walked through the gates of this house. A car will take her away tomorrow morning, and no one in the organization will ever know she was here. I only need your signature before dawn. Cassian set down his pen. You investigated her. I investigate everyone who enters this house, Rourke said. That is my job, and I've been doing it since before you were old enough to drive. Then you know about her brother. I do. And I know about the workshop that burned 2 years ago. And I know exactly how much she falls short every month. That is precisely why I'm giving you this envelope, instead of handling her another way," he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, which only made the words weigh more heavily. Cassian remained silent. Beyond the window, beneath the garden lights, he could see Marin walking along the gravel path toward the servants' wing, carrying a stack of folded towels in both arms. Rourke continued, slowly and clearly, like a man reciting a rule he had written himself. "You are the head of this family, Cassian. The man at the top isn't allowed to have a weakness, least of all a weakness that knows how to stroke his hair. In 3 weeks, 4 at the most, the Sabatini family will know that there is a woman in this mansion whom you don't want to see kneeling on the grass. And the day they learn that, she will no longer be a maid. She will become the shortest road anyone can take to reach you. I'm not sending her away because I hate her. I'm sending her away because I've seen what happens to people who are considered the shortest road." Cassian listened to every word. He thought of the hand that had stopped only one knuckle away from the gun. He thought of the painfully honest answer given by a woman too exhausted to lie, that her younger brother had lain that way for 2 years. He thought of the way those fingers had passed through his hair 3 times, slowly, always in the same direction, the exact direction only one person in the world had ever used. Then he placed 2 fingertips against the envelope and pushed it back toward Rourke. No, Rourke didn't ask again. He didn't argue, sigh, or show disappointment. He picked up, then he wished Cassian good night and left, closing the door very softly behind him. In the corridor, he didn't continue walking at once. He stopped beneath the wall lamp, the envelope still in his hand, his eyes lowered to the stone floor. There was no anger on his face and no regret, but something entirely different. The dry concentration of a man retracing the dates on a calendar only he possessed, counting how many days this moment had thrown out of alignment in a plan that had been unfolding for 16 years. Then he folded the envelope in half, slipped it into his inner pocket, and continued down the corridor. Some advice is so undeniably sound that no one can argue against it. What no one in that house thought to ask that night was why the man giving the advice was so desperate to make her leave. On Tuesday morning, Constance handed Marin a tarnished brass key and told her that the master wanted the old library in the north wing cleaned. Then, in the voice of someone who had just received an order she didn't understand, she added that the room had been locked for 16 years. No one went inside, not because there was anything hidden there, but because it had belonged to the lady of the house, and Cassian had locked it 3 days after the funeral and forbidden anyone to mention it again. Even Mr. Rourke has never set foot in there, she said, because in this house, people may go nosing around anywhere except that room. Marin inserted the key into the lock and had to turn it twice. The door opened upon a scent she recognized at once, the smell of old paper, animal glue, and cedar, the scent in which she had lived for the first 25 years of her life, and had believed she would never breathe again. She stood on the threshold longer than necessary. All 4 walls were covered from floor to ceiling with dark oak shelves, and upon them stood thousands of books, their cloth and leather spines pressed close together beneath a layer of dust accumulated over 16 years, thick as velvet. She worked throughout the morning, and close to noon, she took a book from the 3rd shelf, a volume bound in brown leather, and saw that its spine was broken. She sat on the carpet, took from her apron pocket the spool of linen thread and the bookbinding needle she had carried with her for 2 years, even though there was no longer a workshop in which to use them, and began to sew. She didn't hear the door open. "What are you doing?" Marin looked up with a start. Cassian stood a few steps away, and she had no idea how long he had been there. She started to rise, but he lifted a hand, signaling her not to. "Its spine is broken, sir," she said. "The thread inside has rotted away, so the pages have separated from the cover. If it is left for 1 more summer, it will be ruined completely. It won't be possible to save it." Cassian stepped closer and looked down at her hands. They worked swiftly and with absolute certainty, the needle entering the original holes instead of piercing new ones, and he realized that this wasn't the makeshift repair of someone who merely happened to be good with her hands. This was a trade. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "At home," she replied. "My father bound and restored books in Bridgeport, Delaney and Son. He took work from school libraries, 2 churches, several collectors, and after a few decades, every kind of person eventually brought him a book. I began threading needles for him when I was 6. He used to say my hands were like his." She paused, then continued in the light voice of someone recalling an old family joke. "He had something he always said to customers, and I heard it so often that I grew sick of it. He would tell them that the best place in the world to hide something was inside a book, because everyone assumed it was only a book. He said that whenever anyone asked why a hardcover needed to be made so thick, then she laughed softly, cut the thread, and turned the book over to inspect her stitching. Cassian said nothing. He stood there for a very long time. Long enough that Marin looked up a second time and saw that he wasn't looking at her or at the book in her hands. He was staring at her needed the shelves behind her with the expression of a man who had just heard a very faint sound in a place that should have been completely silent. Something inside his chest had shifted 1/2 centimeter. Something without a name or shape. Only the sensation of being touched precisely where an old bruise had long remained, without understanding why it still hurt. He couldn't trace the feeling to its source. He opened his mouth, then stopped. "Continue," he finally said. "If you find any other damaged books, repair them. If you need anything, tell Mrs. Bloom." Then he turned to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked across all 4 walls of books, as though, for the first time in 16 years, he truly saw them. Then he walked away. Some truths don't arrive with a clap of thunder. They pass us by casually, disguised as an idle story about a dead man, then wait for weeks, sometimes for decades, until the night we become desperate enough to remember them. On Sunday afternoon, Cassian carried a wool blanket out with his own hands and spread it beneath the oak tree, then told Constance to summon Marin. She came with book dust still clinging to her hands, but she didn't sit on the blanket. She sat on the stone bench 3 meters away, both hands resting on her knees, maintaining exactly the distance a servant knew she was expected to keep. Cassian didn't ask her to come closer. He lay down with his head resting on one arm, his eyes turned toward the canopy of leaves, and began to speak without looking at her once, in the voice of a man reading aloud from a report in which he himself was the victim. He said his mother's name was Juliana. She bound books, too, not as a profession, only for pleasure, but she took it more seriously than many people who did it for a living. She owned a small brass stamp engraved with a rose, and she would heat it before pressing it into the leather spine of every book she bound, every single one without exception, like a signature. She always kept peppermint candies in the pocket of her cardigan, and he always knew exactly which pocket they were in. Every night, she read The Wind in the Willows to him, continuing for years even after he had grown far too old to be read to, and she performed the voices of both Toad and Mole. She did them terribly, and he never once told her how terrible they were. Then he stopped for a long while. Marin asked nothing. She had learned that in this house, silence at the right moment was a form of kindness. "When I was 18, he continued, there was an afternoon when I sat in the study watching my mother work. My father came in without knocking, walked straight to her, bent down, and whispered into her ear. I heard 3 words: workshop, cover, tonight, only those 3 words, separate from one another, without a beginning or an end. Then my mother placed the brass stamp on the desk, looked at my father, and said, 'Arturo, don't keep it in the safe anymore.' My father nodded, kissed her hair, and left. I didn't ask. Sons of 18 rarely do." He continued more slowly. "At 11 that night, the front door shattered. My mother was in the study with me. She didn't panic. She didn't make a sound. She pulled away the panel in the corner of the wall. Behind it was an old dumbwaiter shaft from my grandfather's time that was no longer used. She pushed me inside and lowered me 1/2 a floor. Then she pulled the panel closed again. There was a gap between 2 wooden slats, no wider than my little finger. I looked through it, and I saw everything. Marin could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wanted him to stop, and she also knew that he wouldn't, because there are some stories a person must tell all at once, or never tell at all. I saw my father enter the room, he said. Then I saw my mother take 1 step, exactly 1 step, to stand in front of him. After that, she never stood again. Cassian spoke those words in the same voice he had used when speaking of the brass stamp and the peppermint candies, and that was what made Marin shiver. She lay on the carpet and turned her head toward the gap between the slats, he said. She knew I was there. Her lips moved twice without making a sound. The 3rd time, she managed to say 6 words. "Live, my son, and remember the book." I stayed beneath that floor until morning. When daylight came, there was no one left in the house but me. He sat up. From his waistcoat pocket, he took his father's silver pocket watch, opened the lid, looked at it, then closed it again without checking the time, a gesture he performed many times each day and had long since forgotten he was doing. "For 16 years, he said, I've believed that only the first 4 of those 6 words were real. People become confused when they are dying. My mother lived her entire life among books, so she mentioned a book in that final moment. That was all. I believed that for 16 years, because believing anything else would have meant searching for something when I didn't know what it was or where it might be, and I didn't have the strength to do that for 1 more day." Marin looked down at her hands. She thought of her father, and the words he had always repeated to his customers, and she almost spoke them aloud, but she didn't, because at that moment they were only a familiar joke once told by a dead bookbinder, with no connection to the man sitting before her. She only said, "Your mother wasn't confused, sir. I'm certain of it." Cassian turned and looked at her for the first time that entire afternoon. Some final words wait a very long time, not because they are difficult to understand, but because the person who heard them needs exactly 16 years to become brave enough to believe that they meant something. Early Wednesday afternoon, Marin climbed the wooden rolling ladder to clean the highest shelf in the most secluded corner of the library, a place that looked from below like nothing more than a patch of darkness between two columns of shelves. She was up there, nearly 2 meters above head level, when the door opened. She was about to offer a greeting when she heard the lock turn from the inside, and she remained silent. Emmett Rourke walked into the center aisle between the shelves, stopped, and made a call. He spoke briefly in a low voice, the voice of someone who had discussed this many times before and no longer needed to waste words. He said he hadn't found it yet. He said that after 16 years, he still hadn't found it. He said it wasn't beneath the floor, and it wasn't in the safe, and that he had searched every place worth searching long ago. Then he said to let Cassian remain occupied with the girl, because that only made things more convenient. And he told the person on the other end to wait another 2 weeks and not become greedy now. Something the other person said drew a dry laugh from him, a single sound with no amusement in it. 16 years, he said. It's nearly finished. Then he ended the call. He didn't leave immediately. He stood motionless for about 15 seconds, his arms hanging at his sides and his head slightly bowed, like a man performing a calculation in his mind. Then he walked out, passing directly beneath the ladder, less than a meter from Marin's feet, without once looking up. The door opened. The door closed. Marin remained where she was for a very long time, still clutching the cleaning cloth, until both her calves began to ache. When she finally reached the floor, the first thing she did wasn't run. She took the weekly laundry schedule from her apron pocket, turned it over, and wrote down every word she could remember, including the order of the sentences, every place where he had paused, and even the sound of that laugh. 2 years earlier, she had reported something aloud, and watched a man lift his pen, lower it again, and write nothing. So now she no longer told anything aloud before she had first put it on paper. She folded the page into quarters, tucked it inside her dress, and waited until nearly 10 that night, when only one wall lamp remained lit in the second-floor corridor, before knocking on the study door. Cassian told her to enter. She placed the schedule on his desk, smoothed it flat, and spoke for about a minute, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. That afternoon, Mr. Rourke had locked the library door, called someone, and said he had spent 16 years searching for something inside this house without finding it. Then she fell silent. She had prepared herself for an explosion of anger. She had imagined him striking the desk with his hand, summoning his men, and the entire house blazing with light at midnight. None of those things happened. Cassian read the page once, then read it a second time. His expression didn't change. He placed both hands on the desk and asked his first question. When he referred to the person on the other end of the line, did he use the word father, or did he say he? Marin thought back and said that he had used neither. He had only said to wait another 2 weeks, as though the person on the other end possessed the authority to make him wait. Cassian gave a very slight nod and asked his second question. Did he say he hadn't found it yet? Or that he couldn't find it? Yet? She answered without hesitation. He said yet twice. Cassian fell silent. Then came his third question. After ending the call, how long did he remain there? About 15 seconds, she said. He stood still. He didn't look around or search for anything. He simply stood there. Cassian asked no more questions. He folded the schedule, placed it in a drawer, locked the drawer, and sat without moving. The brass lamp made a faint sound. Marin stood on the other side of the desk and realized that she was afraid. More afraid than she had been on the afternoon she knelt on the grass. And what frightened her wasn't anything he said, but what he left unsaid. She had believed that men like him were most dangerous when they were angry. That night, she understood that the opposite was true. Go back to your room, he said. Lock the door. Until I tell you otherwise, you won't mention this to anyone in the house, including Mrs. Bloom. You will continue cleaning the library as usual, and you will greet him as you always do. Can you do that? Marin said she could. At the door, she turned and asked a question she knew violated the second rule. What is he looking for, sir? Cassian looked up. I don't know, he said, but I've just learned something more important. It exists. For 16 years, a person can live peacefully with someone's final words, as long as he believes they mean nothing. That night, someone had inadvertently confirmed that those words did have meaning, and from that moment onward, there was no longer any way back for anyone in that house. On Friday morning, Ridgeview called Marin. She stood in the third-floor corridor with a stack of towels still cradled in her arms, while the woman on the other end spoke in the cheerful voice of someone delivering good news without understanding what kind of news she was carrying. She said Owen Delaney's records had been transferred to North Shore Rehabilitation Institute, that a car from the institute would arrive for him at 10, that he would have a private room, that his 4 weekly physical therapy sessions had been increased to 6, and that every expense had been paid in advance for 18 months. Marin asked who had paid. The woman said the donor had requested anonymity. Marin thanked her, ended the call, and stood there for a long time with the towels in her arms. North Shore was the place a doctor at Mercy had mentioned exactly once 2 years earlier, and never mentioned again. Speaking of it, the way people speak of something merely to acknowledge that it exists, not because they are offering it as a possibility. She went down to the second floor, knocked on the study door, and entered before she had even decided what she intended to say. Cassian was signing a stack of papers. He looked up. "What are you buying?" she asked. He set down his pen. She asked again, and this time her voice no longer held the careful calm of a servant speaking to her employer. "I want to know what you're buying, because I've lived long enough to know that no one pays for 18 months at North Shore for a maid without expecting something in return. If you're buying my silence, say so plainly. I'll remain silent, but I need to know. If it's something else, I want it returned today." Cassian listened to everything without interrupting. Then he said, "I'm not buying anything." She didn't believe him. "I know," he said. He rose, walked to the window, and continued without turning around. "Last week, you told me that if you fell short this month, your brother would be transferred to the general care ward and receive only 2 therapy sessions a week. I heard that, and for 3 days I did nothing. Then I realized that I was standing inside a house guarded by 20 men and protected by a gate weighing more than a ton, while 15 kilometers away, a man of 22 was about to lose 2 therapy sessions a week because he was short a few $1,000s. It wasn't pity. I'm not good at that. I simply won't allow something like that to happen in front of me." Marin remained silent. She had prepared an entire speech against accepting anyone's pity, and now she couldn't use a single word of it. She didn't thank him. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'll repay you. I don't know how long it will take. It may be 5 years or 10, but I'll repay every dollar. You can put it in writing, and I'll sign it." Cassian turned to look at her. He had given money to many people over the course of 11 years. He had given it to families who had just lost someone, to people whose silence had to be secured, and to trembling men and women who accepted it in both hands and called him their benefactor. Every time, he had felt something slick and unpleasant inside his chest that he had never named, because he knew that what he had truly purchased was one more person indebted to him. This was the first time anyone had pushed the money back toward him and demanded a written agreement. "Very well," he said. "You can repay me." He didn't argue even once, and after she had left the room, he remained standing there and realized something strange. He felt lighter. That afternoon, Marin called Owen. He told her that his new room had a window overlooking a courtyard with trees, and that his physical therapist was a Vietnamese woman named Han, who kept making him count aloud during his exercises. Then he asked where the money had come from. "I worked extra hours," she said. He was silent for a moment, and she knew he didn't believe her, but he was also old enough to understand that some questions only caused pain to the person forced to answer them. There are gifts in this world that bind the person who receives them, and there are gifts that only truly become gifts at the exact moment the recipient insists on repaying them. For 3 nights, Cassian didn't sleep, and on each of those nights, he returned to the same sentence. It wasn't beneath the floor. It wasn't in the safe. People only said such words about something that truly existed. No one tore up floors for 16 years in search of a dying woman's delirium. For 16 years, he had believed that only the first 4 of his mother's final 6 words were real, and he had believed it because that belief made life easier to endure. Now someone inside his own house had inadvertently told him that he had been wrong. On the 3rd night, at 3 in the morning, he went downstairs by the rear staircase. He didn't call Rourke. He didn't call any of his 15 capos, or even the men assigned to the night watch, because for the past 48 hours, he had sat in his study doing something he had never done in his life. He had written down the names of the people in that house whom he could still trust, and his pen had stopped when he realized the list was shamefully short. He went into the garden alone, carrying a folding shovel and a small flashlight, and crossed the lawn in darkness. None of the guards stationed along the stone wall more than 100 meters away turned to look, because in this house, the master walking out to the oak tree at midnight was as ordinary as the setting of the sun. He knelt beside the largest root, on the side opposite the stone bench. He planted the flashlight in the grass with its beam aimed at the ground, then began to dig. The hands that had held guns for 20 years worked slowly, almost cautiously, as though they were afraid of hurting the tree that had sheltered his sleep for 16 years. At a depth of about 40 centimeters, the shovel struck something hard with a dry sound. He stopped. He set the shovel aside and cleared away the remaining soil with all 10 fingers. Beneath it lay a tin box the size of a dictionary, wrapped in faded oilcloth. When he peeled away the fabric, the flashlight swept across the lid, revealing a small rose engraved shallowly into the metal. Cassian sank onto the damp earth. He carried the box inside by the rear staircase without allowing anyone to see him, took it to his study, locked the door with 2 turns of the key, closed every curtain, and extinguished every light except the brass lamp on his desk. Then he opened the lid. There were 2 things inside. The first was a photograph. It had been taken beneath that same oak tree on a spring afternoon, with 3 people standing together. His father wore a gray suit. His mother stood in the middle, and on the left was a boy of 18, wearing the resentful expression of a son who had been forced to pose for a picture. On the back, written in blue ink in his mother's slanting hand, were the words, "Our family, our final spring, and may there be many more." He laid his palm over the photograph and kept it there for a long time. The second item was a sealed letter, addressed in the same blue ink. "For my son, when you are old enough to forgive yourself." He opened it. The letter was brief, written in haste, and less than a page long. He read it 3 times. First, his mother wrote that she and his father had known for some time that someone inside their house wasn't one of their own. His father had been following that thread, but he wasn't certain he would have enough time, and the person was far closer than Cassian imagined. Second, she wrote, "Don't answer this with blood, my son. The person who seeks revenge always becomes a darker version of the person who first caused the harm. I watched that happen to your grandfather, and I don't want to witness it a second time." The third thing she wrote made him spring from his chair. "What you need isn't beneath the ground. This box is only meant to lead you to it. It is standing on a shelf, directly before the eyes of the man searching for it, and for all these years, he will pass it every day without knowing. It bears my mark." Then she signed with only 2 words. "Your mother." Cassian slowly sat down again. The brass lamp made a faint sound. For 16 years, he hadn't dug into that earth. Not because he lacked the strength, but because for 16 years, he had believed that his mother had merely been delirious in her final moments. And that night, beneath the brass lamp, for the first time in 16 years, a single drop of water fell and darkened one corner of the page. He carried the letter straight to the north wing, unlocked the library, switched on every light, and stood in the middle of the room, seeing it for the first time through the eyes of someone searching for one specific thing. 4 walls, shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. He calculated the number of compartments and the number of volumes in each, arriving at an estimate of roughly 4,000 books. He began at the lower shelf in the left corner, pulling out each book, examining its spine, then pushing it back into place. By 2 in the morning, he had searched one entire wall. By 3, he understood the problem. His mother had spent her life in this room, and she wasn't the only person in the world who loved roses. The leather spines of those books bore roses pressed into the surface, roses raised from the leather, roses enclosed within frames of gold, roses winding like vines along the length of the spine, the marks of bookbinders from Boston, London, and Milan, with some volumes dating back to the previous century. On a single wall, he counted more than 30 books bearing roses. He picked up 2 of them, placed them side by side beneath the lamp, and studied them for a long time before finally setting them down. He couldn't tell the difference. At 3 in the morning, the most powerful man in Chicago stood among 4,000 of his mother's books and realized that he couldn't recognize her signature. He had watched her use that brass stamp hundreds of times when he was a child, but he had never examined it closely, because children never look closely at anything. Children believe everything will remain where it is forever. Then he thought of the hand that had guided a needle through the original stitching holes. At 4 in the morning, he sent for Marin. She came downstairs with her hair hastily tied back and stopped on the threshold when she saw the room ablaze with light and the books stacked in piles across the floor. Cassian handed her the letter. "Read it," he said. "Read all of it." She did. She read slowly, and when she reached the 3rd part, he He saw her fingers tighten around the edge of the page. She read the line a second time. It is standing on a shelf, directly before the eyes of the man searching for it. It bears my mark. Then Marin looked up, and her face had completely changed. She asked him a question that seemed to have nothing to do with the letter. What was your mother's name, sir? Juliana, he said. Juliana Vitali. Did she often wear a gray cardigan? Cassian couldn't answer at once. Marin sat on the step of the rolling ladder, still holding the letter, and began to speak. Her voice broke at intervals, because she, too, was pulling the memory out of 16 years of earth and mud, one fragment at a time. She said she had been 11 that year. One afternoon in May, just as the workshop was about to close, a woman arrived. She came alone, without anyone accompanying her, and wore a gray cardigan. She was beautiful in the particular way that made a child of 11 steal glances at her. She carried a small, hardcover notebook with a spine sewn in red thread. She didn't ask Marin's father to bind the notebook again. She asked him to do something Marin had never seen anyone request before, and would never see anyone request again. She asked him to bind the notebook inside the cover of another book, an old storybook she had brought in her bag. Marin's father asked twice to make certain he had understood. Then he accepted the work. He labored throughout the night, and Marin was allowed to remain awake beside him because she stubbornly insisted on staying, though she remembered falling asleep in her chair without realizing it. By morning, the work was finished. Her father handed the book to the woman, but she didn't take it home immediately. She removed a small brass stamp from her bag, heated it herself over the workshop's alcohol burner, then pressed a rose into the leather spine with her own hand. She said she wanted to do that part herself. Before leaving, she bent down in front of the child of 11 who was rubbing sleep from her eyes, took a peppermint candy from the pocket of her cardigan, placed it in Marin's palm, and spoke words Marin had remembered for 16 years without ever understanding why. You have hands like your father's. One day, you will keep many things safe. Cassian stood motionless in the middle of the room. On that same afternoon in May, on the other side of the city, a boy of 18 had been sitting in the study without knowing where his mother had just returned from, while peppermint candies for him still remained in the pocket of her cardigan. He heard his own voice emerge in little more than a whisper. What was the story called? Marin looked directly at him. The Wind in the Willows, she said. Some threads are sewn long before people realize that their lives are being stitched together. Cassian walked toward the shelves and began pulling out books to examine their spines. But Marin said, Sir, if we do it that way, we won't finish by tomorrow morning. He stopped. She rose, brushed her hands against her apron, and explained very quickly in the concise voice of someone standing on ground she knew as her own. An ordinary hardcover consisted of 3 layers: board, lining cloth, and leather. If a notebook had been concealed inside it, the cover would have to be at least 5 millimeters thicker, and a cover that thick couldn't flex naturally at the hinge. The joint between the cover and the text block would feel noticeably stiffer. The eyes couldn't detect that. The hands could. She raised her thumb and forefinger and gently pinched the air. Would you hold the light for me? Cassian looked at her for a second, then picked up the flashlight from the table. In his 8 years as the head of the family, it had been a very long time since anyone had assigned him a task. They began at the eastern wall. Marin didn't pull out the books. She moved along the rows of spines, her fingertips passing over each volume, the way a musician's fingers pass over piano keys. Whenever a book felt unusual, she stopped for half a second, tested it with a gentle squeeze, then continued. Cassian walked beside her, holding the beam low and at an angle so it wouldn't shine into her eyes, and he changed the flashlight from one hand to the other whenever she moved to a different shelf. 1 hour passed, then 2. She removed 7 suspicious volumes, examined them, and returned all 7 to their places. Beyond the window and behind the curtains, the sky began to change from black to a thin shade of gray. When she reached the second shelf level in the 11th section from the door, her hand stopped and didn't move any farther. She squeezed the book once. Then she squeezed it again. Shine the light here for me, she said. Cassian lowered the beam. It was a book bound in blue cloth, worn pale at 2 corners, otherwise unremarkable, and shelved among volumes of the same size. Near the bottom of the spine was a rose pressed into the cloth, no larger than the nail of a little finger, so small that it couldn't be seen unless light struck it at an angle. Marin pulled it from the shelf. She opened it to the title page and read the words aloud, not because she needed to, but because she needed to hear herself say them. The Wind in the Willows. They carried the book to the table in the center of the room. Marin didn't use a paper knife. She opened her tool pouch, removed a knife with a thin blade and a length of dental floss, then sat down and drew the lamp closer. Cassian stood across from her with both hands braced against the wooden table, and he didn't hurry her. She tilted the book, shone the light into the joint between the cover and the text block, searched for a while, then lowered the tip of the blade. He saw her hand stop. "What is it?" he asked. Marin didn't answer immediately. She leaned closer, and when she looked up again, her eyes were red. "These are my father's stitches," she said. "He made 2 diagonal stitches, and then tied them with 1 straight stitch. No one else did it that way. He invented the method when he was young, and he used it for the rest of his life. I recognize it as clearly as I would recognize his signature." She drew a breath. Then she guided the blade along that exact line of thread, cutting neither the cover nor the leather, loosening each stitch one at a time, the way something is taken apart when it must later be sewn together again. Cassian said nothing. He only held the light. It took nearly 20 minutes. The leather on the back cover separated from the board, opening like a narrow mouth, and inside, resting perfectly within a compartment cut to the precise millimeter, lay a slender notebook. Its cover was black leather. Its spine was sewn with red thread. Pressed into the lower right corner was the wolf of the Vitali family. Marin removed it and placed it on the table, then pushed it toward him and withdrew her hand like someone who had just touched something that didn't belong to her. Cassian didn't pick it up immediately. He stood looking down at the notebook, and in his mind he saw the 2 hands of a man in a small Bridgeport workshop, staying awake through an entire May night to sew a secret between 2 layers of a book cover, never knowing that 14 years later, he would pay for that night. Some people go through life without ever holding a gun or knowing a single name from the underworld. Yet they are the ones who hold the key to the entire story. Daylight had fully arrived by the time Marin left the library. Cassian carried the notebook upstairs to his study, locked the door, closed the curtains, then sat beneath the brass lamp and opened it. The handwriting belonged to his father, upright, small, and perfectly even, written in ink of deep blue and black, and Cassian knew from the first line that his father had written every word himself, without a secretary and without asking anyone to make a copy, because every page carried the rhythm of a man thinking as he wrote. The notebook contained 2 sections. The first, which was thicker, held a plan spanning 2 years, with lists of meetings, figures, and names connected to a shipping company along the lakefront, a construction firm on the western side of the city, and a group of private banks in Boston. Cassian began to read more slowly, then returned to the beginning and read it again. He sat straighter in his chair. His father hadn't intended to leave him what Cassian had ultimately inherited. He had already gone more than halfway toward removing the entire family from business conducted outside the light and rebuilding it into something whose papers could bear his own name without forcing him to hide his face. He had spent 2 years preparing for that transformation, but hadn't lived long enough to begin it. Cassian set the notebook down. His mother had asked him to do something in her letter, and now he held the blueprint for that very thing, drawn by someone else 16 years earlier. He remained still for a long time before turning to the second section. It was an investigative record. Each person had 1 page. Every page was dated, and beneath each date were brief, dry notes, without a single adjective. The writing of a man who had forbidden himself from reaching a conclusion before he possessed enough evidence. Cassian read the names he knew, the names of people who were dead, and the names of people who were still alive and drawing wages from him that very morning. Some pages contained only 2 lines. On others, the lower half had been left blank. He continued turning the pages at an even pace until he reached the page before the last, the final page bearing any writing. At the top was a name, Emmett Rourke. It was dated 3 weeks before that night. Beneath it were 4 lines. The first stated that Rourke had been loyal for many years and had placed himself between danger and Cassian 3 times. The second stated that during the past 3 months, he had repeatedly met with a man in middle age at a small cafe on Taylor Street, and that the resemblance between their faces was too pronounced to ignore. The third read, suspected blood relative of the Sabatini family. If true, the past 20 years of my life have been a mistake. The fourth contained the final 4 words his father had ever written about that man. Wait for conclusive evidence. Cassian didn't move. The brass lamp made a faint sound. Beyond the curtains, a lawnmower started somewhere far away on the southern lawn. He sat motionless until the coffee in his cup had gone completely cold. And during that time, he didn't think about the Sabatini family, the Western Gate, or any detail of that night. He thought only of one man. The man who had stood waiting beside Ambrose at first light to take a boy of 18 wrapped in a blanket, then carried him across the garden on his shoulder so the boy wouldn't have to see anything more. The man who placed the first gun in his hand 3 months later, stood behind him, adjusted his wrist into the proper position, and told him to breathe out before pulling the trigger. The man who stood to his left in the great hall on the day Cassian, at 26, assumed leadership of the family. The only person in the room who wasn't required to bow because he had bowed long before. The man who had been shot twice and stabbed once in the years between, all 3 times because he had stepped in front of Cassian. Cassian looked down at the 4 dry lines in the notebook and searched his mind for another explanation. He searched sincerely. Perhaps the man at the cafe was a distant relative. Perhaps his father had grown old and suspicious. Perhaps those 3 months of meetings meant nothing at all. But then he heard again the words that had traveled between the library shelves. After 16 years, I still haven't found it. One by one, every other explanation went dark, like corridor lamps extinguishing in succession toward the far end of a hall. He closed the notebook. He didn't summon anyone. He didn't strike the desk with his hand. He simply sat there with both palms resting flat against the wood and allowed one very simple truth to travel the full length of his body. Betrayal by a stranger costs a piece of skin. Betrayal by the man who received you from that wall and sheltered you for 16 years costs the entire definition of the world in which you have lived for 16 years. The next morning, Cassian summoned Marin to the study because she was the only person in the house who knew the notebook existed, and he believed she had the right to know what it contained. He opened it to the page before the last and turned the notebook toward her. She read the 4 lines. She read the name at the top of the page, then read it again, and asked a question that sounded almost aimless, the kind of question someone asks when a faint sound has just stirred inside the mind, but hasn't yet revealed what it is. Is there anything unusual about this man's hands, sir? Cassian didn't understand why she was asking. He answered without thinking, because it was a detail everyone in the house knew, and no one ever discussed. He wears gloves, he said. He has worn them in every season for 20 years. One joint of his left little finger is missing from something that happened when he was young. He has never told anyone how. Marin said nothing. She reached behind her, searched for the back of the chair, and sat down, not because she wanted to sit, but because her legs had suddenly stopped supporting her. Cassian walked around the desk. She stared down at the carpet and began to speak in a very calm voice, the frightening calm of someone reciting something she had known by heart for 2 years, but that no one had ever been willing to hear in full. She told him that on the night the workshop burned, she had been the first person to run into the street. She told him that as she stood in the middle of Morgan Street and looked back, there was a man across the road, beneath the awning of the closed auto repair shop, watching. He didn't run toward the fire. He didn't call anyone. He showed no alarm. He merely stood with both hands in his pockets, then turned and walked away. She told him that she had described the man to the investigator 3 times, and all 3 times, she had watched the tip of his pen stop against the paper, before lifting without writing anything down. In the end, that detail appeared nowhere in the file. Not one line mentioned it. Then she looked up at Cassian and spoke the part she had never been able to say aloud during those 2 years because, until now, it had been nothing more than a meaningless fragment. He was wearing gloves, sir. In the middle of April, at 4:15 in the morning, the study remained silent for a long time. Cassian stood there and watched 2 events that had seemed entirely unrelated. Events that had occurred 14 years apart, on opposite sides of the city, slide together like the 2 halves of an old lock. His father had died because of a notebook. 14 years later, a bookbinder in Bridgeport had died because of that same notebook, because there had been only one person in the world who knew which book it had been sewn into, and that person was the man who had sewn it there with his own hands. The other man had found him. The other man had come to him, and Hollis Delaney hadn't spoken. Marin said it before Cassian could. "My father didn't die because of an electrical short," she said, and her voice broke on the final word. "He died because he didn't tell them. If he had told them, he would have made it out of that workshop that night." Cassian sat in the chair across from her, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. Then, in a low and measured voice, he told her that she had to leave, that very night. There would be a car and men he trusted to take her to North Shore, where she could remain with her brother. There would be money and another name if she needed one. He told her that from the moment she finished telling him what had happened, she was no longer a maid in his house. She had become the only living witness to something the other man had killed to silence. And in Cassian's world, people in that position didn't live long. Marin listened to everything. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, then stood. And when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. "You had 16 years to wait for an answer, sir. I had 2. For 2 years, every time I told anyone about the man wearing gloves, they looked at me the way people look at a grieving woman who has invented a story to make her pain easier to bear. Today was the first time anyone believed me. And you want me to take your money and get into a car on that very day? She pushed the notebook back to the center of the desk. I'm not going anywhere. That afternoon, Cassian put on a canvas coat that no one in the house had ever seen him wear, left through the delivery gate, and took the train into the city like a man returning late from work. He got off at Taylor Street and walked another 3 blocks through the rain. The cafe was still there, small and old, with 6 tables, and he sat at the table farthest inside, the same table his father had recorded in the notebook 16 years earlier, without ever imagining that his son would one day sit there. Ambrose Lazari arrived 10 minutes later. He was a man of 63 with silver hair and shoulders that were still broad, and he sat down without offering his hand. He merely studied Cassian for a long time before saying, "For 16 years, I've prayed for 2 things. First, that you would never call me. Second, that if you did, it wouldn't be for the reason I have always feared." Cassian pushed a stack of photocopied pages across the table. Ambrose wiped his hands on a paper napkin before picking them up, the habit of a man who had once worked with important documents, then began to read. He read the plan first and nodded several times, faintly, like someone hearing a familiar voice again. Then he turned to the page before the last. Cassian saw the old man's hand stop in the air. Ambrose read the 4 lines twice. Then he placed the pages on the table, resting both hands beside them, and they trembled very slightly, though not from age. "Your father told me about this," he said. "3 weeks before that night, he summoned me here, to this very table, and told me about the meetings in the cafe and the resemblance between those 2 faces. Then he asked what I thought. I told him he had been working too hard and had begun seeing ghosts. I told him that boy had been with our family since he was 25, and that if your father suspected even him, he would soon have to suspect me as well." I laughed. Ambrose stopped. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. 3 weeks later, I was the man who opened the panel to the dumbwaiter shaft and carried you across the garden. For the next 16 years, I thought about that night every day, yet not once did I think again about this afternoon. I was wrong for 16 years, Cassian. Cassian said nothing for a while. Then he said, "I didn't come here for an apology. I came because I need someone outside that house." Ambrose looked up. "What are you planning to do?" "Nothing," Cassian said. "Not until I'm certain." My father's final 4 words were, "Wait for conclusive evidence." I read that sentence 3 times last night. I can't condemn a man who has 3 times placed himself between me and danger solely because of 1 line of suspicion written by someone who has been dead for 16 years. If he is innocent, then I will be the betrayer, not him. Ambrose nodded slowly, and something close to relief appeared in his eyes. "Then don't search for the evidence," he said. "The evidence is in his hands, not yours. Make him reveal it himself." They remained at the table for nearly another hour. They didn't discuss revenge. They discussed something else, something far more precise and cold. How to allow 1 piece of information to pass through exactly 4 minds, and how to determine which mind had allowed it to leak. Ambrose said he needed 4 days and 10 men, none of whom still drew wages from the Vitali family. Cassian said he would handle everything inside the house. When they rose, Ambrose caught Cassian by the wrist and held him for a second. "If I'm wrong again," he said, "this time I won't live long enough to regret it." Cassian walked back to the station through the rain, and throughout the train ride home, he thought only of his father's 4 words. Some people spend 16 years searching for the guilty man. The far more difficult task, and the one his father had left him, is to keep from becoming the man who condemns someone innocent merely because he has waited too long. At 9 on Monday morning, Cassian called a meeting in the study and summoned only 4 people. Emmett Rourke sat to his left, as he had for 20 years. The other 3 sat in a row across from the desk. 3 men whose names had belonged to the organization longer than Cassian had led it. He spoke briefly. He said that after what had happened at the southern docks the previous month, the family's largest warehouse was no longer secure, and everything stored there would be moved on Wednesday night. He gave them a departure time. He gave them a route. He gave them a code phrase the convoy would use to communicate, then repeated it once to make certain they had heard correctly. He said the support team would maintain complete silence unless engaged. Then he sat back and allowed the room to speak for itself. The first man opened a notebook and wrote in pencil, slowly and carefully, underlining the departure time twice. The second nodded twice when Cassian mentioned the size of the shipment and asked 1 question about the backup vehicle. The third looked out the window several times in the manner of someone whose mind was somewhere else. Rourke wrote in shorthand, using the private abbreviations he had employed for 20 years. He asked no questions, and his expression didn't change. But at the precise second Cassian stated the departure time, Something flared in those dark brown eyes and immediately disappeared, so quickly that a blink would have missed it. It was the light of a man who had just received something he had waited a very long time to obtain, and had instantly concealed it. 20 years earlier, Cassian wouldn't have recognized it. 20 years earlier, he had been the boy whose wrist this very man held and corrected into the proper position. Now he recognized it. His voice didn't change. He didn't allow his gaze to linger for even half a second. He continued assigning responsibilities, then ended the meeting exactly as he would have ended any ordinary meeting. When the 4 men rose to leave, Rourke was the last one out, and he even stopped at the door to remind Cassian to drink his coffee before it grew cold. For the next 2 days, Cassian lived as usual. He ate breakfast at the head of the long table. He signed papers. He passed the library once without entering. He didn't say a word to Marin about what was being prepared, and she asked no questions, though each night she left the light in the 3rd-floor corridor burning longer than usual. On Wednesday night, 3 trucks departed the warehouse at the announced time, followed the announced route, and used the announced code phrase. Their cargo holds contained nothing except lumber and scrap iron, carefully stacked and secured to give them the proper weight. The drivers were Ambrose Lazari's men. None of them drew wages from the Vitali family, and none knew the names of the 3 men who had sat in the study on Monday morning. On the section of road Cassian had named during the meeting, a group had already been waiting for more than an hour, with their lights extinguished and their vehicles positioned toward the way out. They were in the right place at the right time, waiting for that exact convoy. What they didn't know was that 10 other men had been waiting for them along both sides of the road since that afternoon. It was over in less than 2 minutes, and not one of their vehicles escaped that stretch of road. In his study, Cassian sat alone beneath the brass lamp, with a cup of cold black coffee and a wireless earpiece. He heard Ambrose's clipped voice. "It's done. Exactly as you said. Right time. Right place." Then the old man asked, "Are you still there?" Cassian didn't answer. He removed the earpiece, placed it on the desk, and sat perfectly straight for a long time. He didn't smile. He didn't clench his hands. He merely closed his eyes and released one long, slow breath. The breath of a man who had spent 48 hours telling himself there was still a chance he was wrong, and had just been deprived of that final possibility. Only 4 people in the house knew the departure time, the route, and the code phrase. 3 of them were still sleeping beneath that roof that night, and hadn't left it once. The 4th had sat at Cassian's left hand for 20 years. There are nights when people pray to be wrong, and there are nights when the truth arrives on schedule like a train. Not a minute early, and not a minute late, indifferent to whoever may be waiting on the platform. On Thursday morning, Cassian drove a food delivery truck through the side gate himself, with Marin sitting in the back seat and a cloth bag resting on her lap. He said nothing for the first 20 minutes. Then he said, 3 days. Only 3 days. After that, you may go wherever you wish, or remain if that is what you choose. He took her to a narrow brick house on the north side, where Ambrose Lazari was waiting with 4 older men, whom Cassian called his father's men. Before turning the truck around, he told her one final thing, speaking in the voice of someone explaining a rule, not offering reassurance. "Your brother won't be brought here. Tomorrow morning, one of Uncle Ambrose's men will collect him from North Shore and take him by another route to another place. You won't be told where it is until this is over." Marin began to object. Cassian cut her off. "In my profession, there is one lesson people learn very early," he said. "Never keep 2 people you need to protect in the same place. If I did that, I would simply be placing both of you inside one box and writing the address on it." She fell silent, then nodded. That evening, Cassian returned to the mansion and did something he had considered throughout the afternoon. He sat in his study, left the door open by exactly the width of one hand, and waited. Close to 9, he heard the familiar sound of shoes approaching from the far end of the corridor. When those footsteps were about 10 paces from the door, he picked up the telephone on his desk and called Ambrose. He spoke just loudly enough to be heard. "Uncle, I found it. It was still in the same place beside the oak tree. I haven't dared bring it into the house. Send someone tomorrow morning, and I'll have it moved before noon." On the other end, Ambrose played the part of an old man who had just been awakened and responded exactly as they had rehearsed the night before. In the corridor, the footsteps slowed for precisely half a second outside the study. Only half a second. Then they continued at their normal pace. Cassian lowered the receiver and stared at the brass lamp for a long time. Beginning at 10 that night, 15 of his gunmen moved into position within the darkness of the garden, along the rose beds, at the foot of the stone wall, and beneath the low porches of the small cottages used by the gardeners. Their radios remained silent. No one smoked. No one spoke. At 2:10 in the morning, The western gate opened. It wasn't forced. It didn't require a key. It opened silently from within, exactly as it had opened on a night 16 years earlier. And Cassian stood in the shadow of the oak tree, watching it open while something inside his chest finally died completely. Emmett Rourke entered first, with 12 men following behind him, spreading into a wedge and moving quietly along the gravel path toward the tree. He walked with the easy stride of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind for years and knew precisely how it would unfold. Cassian stepped out of the shadows. His hands were empty. 16 years, he said. You waited that long? Rourke stopped dead. For 1 second beneath the thin moonlight, Cassian watched the mask fall away, and the face beneath it wasn't the face of the man who had sheltered him on the morning of his ruin. It was the face of someone Cassian had never met in his life. Then everything happened at once. Floodlights blazed from all 4 corners of the house, turning the entire lawn into daylight. 15 guns rose from the darkness, and Ambrose's voice came from beside the stone wall, ordering everyone to place their weapons on the grass. 6 men obeyed within 10 seconds. But Rourke had planned for the possibility of defeat. He raised his left hand and swept it through the air. Beside the western gate, a vehicle exploded, throwing up a wall of dense black smoke that none of the floodlights could penetrate. By the time the smoke began to thin, the gate stood empty. Rourke and 4 other men were gone. This wasn't the reckless act of someone driven into a corner. That vehicle had been positioned there days earlier. Cassian stood in the middle of the lawn amid the smell of smoke. He gave no order to pursue them. Ambrose approached, placed a hand on his shoulder, and squeezed once. Don't follow him, the old man said. He won't run far. He will go looking for the softest part of you. Cassian had taken out his telephone before Ambrose finished speaking. He called the brick house on the north side. The telephone rang once, then twice, then 3 times. No one answered. A cornered wolf never runs toward its own den. It runs toward the place it knows has no teeth. Cassian called the number 3 more times as he walked back into the house, and each time, the telephone rang until the call ended on its own. He went upstairs to the study with the smell of smoke still clinging to his coat, placed the telephone on the desk, and sat staring at it. At 3:15 in the morning, it vibrated. An unknown number. The message contained no words, only a video lasting 30 seconds. He opened it. The image trembled slightly beneath the murky yellow light of a bare bulb swinging from the ceiling. Behind it were old crates stacked into narrow aisles and a section of water-stained concrete wall. It was an abandoned warehouse, and through the gap beneath the rolling door behind the person holding the camera, Cassian could see the black water of the river. Marin sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the warehouse floor. Her hair had fallen loose over one side. She didn't cry out. She stared directly into the camera with an expression Cassian had seen once before. The look of someone trying to tell him something without being permitted to speak. About 10 meters behind her stood a closed iron door with a horizontal bar locked across it. The camera paused on that door for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough for the viewer to understand that someone was inside, then moved away. Cassian knew who was behind it. That morning, Ambrose had sent 2 vehicles to collect Owen from North Shore along a route known to only 3 people, and one of those 3 had spent 20 years arranging every route used by this family. Then Emmett Rourke stepped into the frame. He stood behind the chair, and the first thing he did wasn't speak. He slowly raised his left hand toward the camera and removed the leather glove 1 finger at a time. Then he spread his bare hand before the lens and held it there for several seconds. One joint of his little finger was missing. This wasn't a threat intended for Cassian. It was a message for the woman sitting in the chair, the woman who had stood in the middle of Morgan Street at 4:15 in the morning, 2 years earlier, and had described that detail 3 times to people who hadn't cared enough to write it down. Rourke wanted her to know that he knew she had seen him. Only then did he speak, his voice as calm as if he were reading an inventory list. Bring the notebook. Come alone. Bring no one. Before daylight, the video ended. Cassian set down the telephone. He didn't rise immediately. He remained still for about a minute, and during that minute, he didn't see the warehouse. He saw a carpet and a gap between wooden slats, no wider than his little finger. Then the telephone vibrated again. Ambrose. The old man's voice broke in and out, with wind rushing across the connection. I couldn't hold them, he said. There were 8 of them. They even knew the rear entrance. I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry. You're alive. That is enough, Cassian said, and he heard his own voice emerge with such calm that even he found it strange. Now listen to me. Call the 10 best men you still have. No one connected to this house. Meet at the eastern riverfront in 1 hour. I will go inside. You will close the perimeter and make no move until I have reached the innermost part of the building. Ambrose was silent for a moment. Cassian, he said, You know it is a trap. I know, Cassian replied. I'm not going because I believe I will make it out. I'm going because I couldn't live with what will happen if I don't. He ended the call. He opened the steel cabinet in the corner of the study and prepared for 15 minutes, performing every task slowly and neatly, like a man folding clothes. Then he picked up the notebook Ambrose had commissioned from an old bookshop earlier that week. It had a black leather cover, a spine sewn with red thread, a rose stamped into the lower spine, the wolf pressed into one corner, and 30 opening pages copied by hand in nearly identical ink. The real notebook remained in the locked drawer. Before leaving the room, Cassian sat down one final time and photographed the entire investigative section at the end of the notebook, specifically the pages concerning Emmett Rourke and the Sabatini family, without photographing a single line from the plan. Then he scheduled the images to be sent to the mailbox of a federal prosecutor at 7 that morning. If he didn't return, someone else would read them. He extinguished the light. Some traps are laid to take a person's life. Others are laid to make someone walk into them willingly, because the person who set the trap knows that what waits inside is worth more than life itself. At 4:30 in the morning, a car dropped Cassian 2 blocks from the warehouse, and he walked the remaining distance through the mist rising from the river. He passed through a wire mesh gate that had been broken long ago, and 4 of Rourke's men were waiting at the entrance. They searched him thoroughly, running their hands along both sides of his body and down each trouser leg, and they took the gun concealed beneath his left ribs. They didn't think to remove the strip of cloth wrapped around his right wrist beneath his sleeve. They allowed him inside. Old crates had been arranged in 2 long rows, creating an aisle that ran the full length of the warehouse, and at the end of it was an open space containing the wooden chair, a long table, and the swinging bulb hanging from the ceiling. Marin sat in the chair. When she saw him, she pressed her lips together and gave the smallest shake of her head, telling him not to come any closer. He continued walking. About 10 meters behind her, the iron door remained closed, its heavy horizontal bolt still locked in place. Emmett Rourke stood on the opposite side of the long table. Cassian placed the notebook on its surface, then stepped back exactly 3 paces. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Rourke came forward. He didn't open the notebook to read it. He picked it up, tilted it sideways, and brought the leather spine close beneath the light, examining the lowest part of the spine where the rose had been pressed into the leather. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he raised his head, and on his face was a smile Cassian had never seen in 20 years. For 16 years, I've been searching for this exact mark, he said. I've held more than 200 books with roses on their spines. I know how deeply she pressed her stamp, which direction it leaned, and where one line was missing from the stem. Did you truly believe I wouldn't recognize a rose stamped incorrectly? Before the final words had completely left his mouth, glass shattered all at once outside along the eastern wall of the warehouse, followed by men shouting from 3 directions simultaneously. Ambrose's perimeter team was in position. The 4 men near the entrance turned toward the sound. In precisely that half-second, Cassian's first action wasn't to reach for what he had concealed inside his sleeve. He charged toward the long wooden table, drove his shoulder beneath its edge, and overturned it, raising its thick surface into a shield between the wooden chair and the entrance. Then he threw himself behind it. Marin, he said, get down. Stay flat against the floor. Don't raise your head. He didn't stop to cut her restraints. He ran another 10 meters toward the iron door. The horizontal bolt was heavy and rusted, and he had to strike it twice with his entire forearm before it broke loose. The door opened. Inside was a small storage room swallowed in darkness, and Owen Delaney sat in his wheelchair facing the doorway, both hands resting on the wheel rims and his shoulders drawn tight. He wasn't restrained. All they had needed to do was lock a door. Who are you? He asked. I'm the man your sister works for, Cassian said. Hold on tightly. He offered no further explanation. He moved behind the wheelchair, pushed Owen out of the storage room, then guided him along the inner side of the row of crates, completely hidden from the open area in the center, heading toward the small door in the northern end of the building that Ambrose had described over the telephone. He pushed quickly with his head lowered, and when they reached a drainage channel cut into the floor, he lifted the front wheels over it with one hand. Where is my sister? Owen asked. She is behind me, and I'm going back for her, Cassian said. You are leaving first. The small door opened onto a wet concrete yard, and Ambrose Lazzari was waiting there beside the wall with 2 other men. The old man seized the handles of the wheelchair. Take him to the last car, Cassian said. Go now. Don't let him look back. Then he turned and went inside again. Owen Delaney left that place before anything else could happen, and for the rest of his life, He would know that night only through the stories other people told him. Some men spend their entire lives reaching for a gun first. That night, the first thing the most powerful man in Chicago did after walking into a trap built for him was open a locked door so that someone who couldn't stand could escape before anyone else. He ran back inside. Outside, noise erupted in rapid bursts along all three walls. Rourke's men had been driven away from the entrance, and no one had a moment to look toward the far end of the warehouse. Cassian moved behind the upturned table. Marin remained bent low in the chair, exactly as he had instructed. He dropped to one knee on the floor, drew the thin knife from the cloth wrapped around his wrist, and slipped it beneath the rope, binding her hands behind the chair. His head was lowered. His eyes were fixed on the rope. He didn't look up. High above them, a narrow iron catwalk ran the length of the warehouse along the western wall, and the stairs leading to it were concealed behind the rows of crates. Emmett Rourke had climbed there the moment the first window shattered. He stood directly above them, with his arm extended and his weapon aimed downward. Cassian didn't see him. Marin did. She saw him because she was seated facing that direction, and she saw him before her mind had time to name what she was seeing. The rope had just broken. Her hands had only just come free behind the chair. She didn't hesitate for even 1,000th of a second. She didn't cry out. She sprang from the chair and threw herself across the distance between them, reaching the man kneeling on the concrete floor in time. The dry crack of a gunshot struck the corrugated metal roof and echoed back. Marin collapsed into Cassian's arms. He caught her with both hands and sank onto the floor, and he saw that her left shoulder would no longer move. He called her name. Her eyes were still open. She looked at him and tried to say something, but only a breath emerged. At that exact moment, something flared to life inside Cassian's mind like a projector someone had suddenly switched on. He saw another study and another carpet 16 years earlier. He saw his mother take exactly one step to stand in front of his father. He saw her turn her head toward the gap between the wooden slats and speak 6 words. And for the first time in 16 years, he understood that she had never told him to search for anyone. Live, my son, didn't mean he was supposed to survive so he could hunt. It meant he was supposed to hold on to the person still breathing in his arms. He lowered Marin to the floor, supporting the back of her neck with one hand while pressing the other firmly against her left shoulder. "Look at me," he said. "Marin, look at me." She did. Then he raised the gun he had snatched from the floor when overturning the table and fired 3 shots at the iron catwalk, not to hit Rourke, but to cut off his path across the narrow platform. The bullet struck the railing and burst into 3 showers of sparks. Rourke dropped behind the iron barrier, rolled once, then ran toward the small door at the far end of the catwalk and disappeared into the workshop behind it. Cassian didn't pursue him. He bent over Marin and kept his hand pressed firmly against her shoulder. Outside, the noise gradually thinned and finally stopped. The entrance doors burst open, and Ambrose's men rushed inside with the nurse Cassian had arranged to travel in the second vehicle. They reached Marin quickly and asked no questions. Cassian didn't remove his hand until another hand replaced it in exactly the same place. Then he stood and spoke to the nurse in the voice he had used his entire life to give orders, though this time it didn't sound like an order at all. "Save her, whatever it costs. Go now. Don't wait for me." They lifted her. Only then did Marin manage to speak. She said her brother's name. Cassian bent close to her face and said, "He left here 10 minutes ago. He is in a car with Uncle Ambrose. He didn't see anything." He watched her close her eyes. He continued watching until the door shut behind them. Then he stood alone in the warehouse beneath the light that was still swinging overhead, bent down, and picked up what he had just placed on the concrete floor. For 16 years, he had lived like a man repaying a debt to someone who was dead. That night, he rose and continued forward, not for the person who had fallen 16 years earlier, but for the person who had just been carried through that door and was still breathing. Emmett Rourke left the rear workshop through the dock entrance and made it about 40 meters along the river before realizing that Ambrose's outer perimeter had already closed before he ever climbed onto the iron catwalk. They stopped him at the end of the dock. He was captured alive, wounded in the right thigh and unable to walk, and when Cassian reached him, he was sitting with his back against a concrete pillar, breathing in short gasps, his left glove lost somewhere along the way. Cassian stood before him for a long time. The eastern sky had begun to turn gray. Ambrose's men stepped back in a broad arc, and no one spoke because they all knew what usually happened at precisely this moment. Cassian drew nothing. "You are going to speak," he said. "Not to me. You are going to speak to my father, to my mother, and to a bookbinder named Hollis Delaney, a man whose name you haven't spoken once in the past 2 years." Then he turned away and ordered them to put Rourke in the car. At 7 that morning, The great hall of the lakeside mansion was transformed into a place no court in the city would have recognized. Ambrose Lazari stood on one side, his coat still damp with river mist. Opposite him, the remaining capos of the Vitali family stood in a line, and no one sat. At the far end of the hall, seated in 3 high-backed chairs that had been hastily arranged, were 3 older men from 3 neutral Chicago families. They had been summoned at 4 that morning to bear witness under the old law with which everyone in the room had been raised. Rourke was helped into the center of the stone floor and placed in a chair. The oldest of the 3 men spoke only once. "You will tell us everything. If any part of your statement is later proven false, our 3 families will judge you under our own law. Do you understand?" Rourke nodded. Then he began to confess. And as he continued, his voice grew steadier, the steadiness of someone who had carried something for too long and had finally been allowed to put it down. He confessed that Rourke wasn't his name by blood. He was the illegitimate son of the head of the Sabatini family and a woman from Cicero, raised outside the family and taught from childhood that when the time came, there would be a task for him to perform. He confessed that he had been placed inside the Vitali family when he was 25, not to destroy it, but to wait. He confessed that after that night, the order he received wasn't to withdraw, but to remain and become the most loyal man left among the ruins, to teach the surviving boy how to hold a gun, to stand at his left hand on the day he assumed leadership, to wait until he had rebuilt the empire into something large enough to be worth taking, and then to take it. He recited the number of those years like a man reading the timetable of his own life. Then he confessed the final part. 2 years earlier, an old receipt among the lady of the house's papers had led him to a small bookbinding workshop in Bridgeport, and he had gone to see the craftsman who worked there. The bookbinder hadn't told him anything. Rourke spoke those words in a flat voice, and the entire great hall fell silent. Cassian had stood at the head of the room, from beginning to end, with both hands in his coat pockets, never interrupting once. When Rourke finished, Cassian crossed the stone floor, bent down, and spoke softly enough that only one person could hear. "My father wrote 4 words about you on the final page of his life. Wait for conclusive evidence. He was leaving you one chance to prove that he had been wrong about you. You extinguished that chance with your own hands. I won't give you another." Cassian straightened and nodded to Ambrose. Rourke didn't fall on that stone floor. They took him out through the main doors, and by 9 that morning, he and complete copies of the investigative section of Arturo Vitali's notebook were in the custody of a federal prosecutor, accompanied by a confession witnessed by 3 families. No one in that room had expected it. And yet it was the one thing his mother had instructed him to do in the letter buried beneath the tree. Some men choose to stand in the light for 20 years so no one will see them. And in the end, what brings them down isn't a bullet, but a page written by a man 3 weeks before his death, then left to wait patiently for 16 years. 6 months passed, and spring returned to the lawn beside the lake. The old oak tree, which for so many years had drawn its canopy closed like a man pulling his coat tight against the wind, put out tender green buds across every branch, and from a distance, it looked 10 years younger. Marin lived. 9 hours in surgery and 3 months of recovery left a round scar the size of a coin over her left collarbone. Every morning before daylight fully arrived, Cassian bent down and pressed his lips to that exact place once, very gently. It was a small ritual known only to the 2 of them, and he never spoke while doing it because no words were necessary. He had done what his mother asked of him in the letter buried beneath the tree. The business dealings that existed outside the light were closed down one by one, though some took many months and a great deal of money to end cleanly. 3/4 of the Vitali family's assets were transferred into a shipping company along the lakefront, and 2 construction firms on the western side of the city, exactly according to the plan his father had drawn during the final 2 years of his life, but hadn't lived long enough to begin. A scholarship fund bearing Giuliana Vitali's name was established for children in the city who had lost their parents to violence. Ambrose Lazari accepted the position of honorary chairman with tears in his aging eyes and a trembling hand as he signed the papers. In the eastern corner of the mansion grounds, an old storage building was cleared and transformed into a small workshop with windows facing south, and on its door hung a wooden sign engraved with the words Delaney and Son. Marin taught book restoration there without charging tuition, and her first class had 8 students. Owen sat at the first table beside the window. After 6 months at North Shore, 2 fingers on his right hand had begun moving again, and every day he practiced sewing book spines for 1 hour, slowly, making many mistakes, then removing the stitches and beginning again. One afternoon near the end of April, Cassian spread the wool blanket beneath the oak tree and lay down. He closed his eyes. This time, he didn't close them to escape the world, but to listen to it. Marin sat with her back against the trunk and opened The Wind in the Willows, which she had rebound with her own hands in a new leather cover while preserving the original rose on its spine, and she began to read aloud. She wasn't especially good at it, and her voice for Toad was terrible, which was precisely what made Cassian press his lips together to keep from laughing. A young leaf fell into his hair. She removed it, then smoothed his hair back 3 times, slowly, always in the same direction. He smiled. No one captured that smile except the old oak tree that had stood watch over 3 generations of this family. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where the story of the man beneath the oak tree comes to an end. What this journey wishes to place gently into your hands is this: a person's true strength is never measured by what they can destroy, but by what they ultimately choose to protect. An empire can be lost in a single night, yet one hand resting upon the hair of someone who is weary can rewrite an entire life. And sometimes, the smallest kindness we offer without a second thought travels a very long road before returning to save us. How did tonight's story make you feel? And has a small gesture from someone ever completely changed the direction of your life? Please leave a few words in the comments. We read every story you share, and sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. If this story touched you for even a moment, please leave a like. Share it with someone you have always wanted to thank but haven't yet had the opportunity to. And subscribe to our channel so that each day, more beautiful stories can find their way home to you. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.